At exactly 6:40 p.m., I turned my car into the gravel lot in front of the small shoe store I had spent 8 years building from the ground up. The evening sun was dropping behind the tall Oregon trees, turning the front windows into sheets of amber light. For a brief second, everything looked completely normal. The wooden store sign hung above the entrance exactly where it always had. The display racks inside the window still held the same rows of polished leather boots and sneakers I had arranged that morning before leaving for work. Then I saw the bright orange boards staked into the grass beside the walkway. The words were impossible to miss. Notice of foreclosure sale. This property will be auctioned by the bank in 14 days. I stopped halfway to the door. My store had no mortgage. I had paid for the land, the construction, and every inch of that building myself. Yet according to the document attached beneath the sign, a bank believed it had the legal right to seize everything I had built. As I stood there staring at the notice, a cold realization began settling into my chest. Someone hadn't made a mistake. Someone had used my name to borrow a massive amount of money. My name is Stephanie Carter. I'm 32 years old, and during the day I work as a human resources manager at one of the largest shoe manufacturing companies in Oregon. My job revolves around resolving conflicts before they explode, documenting decisions carefully, and protecting the people and systems inside the company. But the small retail shop standing in front of me was something completely different. 8 years earlier, I had purchased the empty lot outside Portland with my savings and slowly turned it into an independent shoe store of my own. I paid cash for the land. I paid cash for the construction. Every shelf, every display rack, and every pair of inventory shoes had been purchased without borrowing a single dollar from a bank. That was why the foreclosure notice made absolutely no sense. I stepped closer to the sign and read every line slowly, making sure I wasn't misunderstanding anything. The document listed a commercial mortgage tied to the property. The amount of the loan was $850,000. Beneath that was a foreclosure case number and the name of a regional bank located in downtown Portland. According to the notice, the borrower had failed to make payments for several months, triggering the bank's legal right to auction the property within 14 days. I pulled out my phone and took several photographs of the notice from different angles. Years of working in HR had taught me one simple rule: document everything before reacting. Once I finished taking the photos, I dialed the phone number printed at the bottom of the foreclosure document. A customer service representative answered after 2 rings. "I'm calling about a foreclosure notice posted on my property," I said. I read the case number directly from the paper. The representative typed for several seconds before responding. "Yes, that loan is currently in default," she confirmed. "The foreclosure process has already been initiated." "There must be a mistake," I said carefully. "I never applied for a mortgage on that property." The woman paused, then replied with the kind of polite neutrality used by people who rely entirely on what the system shows them. "According to our records, the mortgage was approved approximately 8 months ago and signed by the borrower." "Signed by who?" I asked. "Stephanie Carter." I ended the call and stood there for a moment, listening to the quiet evening air around the store. Somewhere down the road, a car passed by, its headlights briefly sweeping across the orange foreclosure sign before disappearing again. My name was on a mortgage I had never taken out. Someone had signed documents pretending to be me. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside the store. The familiar smell of leather and wood polish filled the room as I walked toward the small office in the back. If a mortgage really existed on this property, it would have been recorded in the county's public land registry. Within minutes, I was sitting at the desk, typing the parcel number of the property into the official database. I expected to see the same clean ownership history that had always existed. Instead, a new document appeared in the property record list, a deed of trust filed 8 months earlier. Attached to it was a scanned mortgage contract bearing a signature that looked exactly like mine. I stared at the mortgage document on the screen for several long seconds, barely breathing as my eyes moved across the final page. There it was, directly above the printed borrower name, Stephanie Carter. The signature looked perfect at first glance. The sweeping S, the curved line in Carter, even the slight tilt I always used when signing official paperwork. Anyone who didn't know me would have believed it instantly. But I had signed my name thousands of times in my life, and something about this one felt wrong. The strokes were too smooth, too evenly spaced. My real signature always carried tiny imperfections created by speed and habit. This one looked like someone had carefully practiced it until it matched. Someone had forged my name. I leaned forward and began scrolling slowly through the rest of the mortgage contract. The lender listed was a regional bank based in Portland. The loan amount was exactly $850,000, secured by the land and building where my shoe store stood. According to the document history, the mortgage had been approved 8 months earlier and officially recorded with the county shortly afterward. That meant the bank believed the property had been legally pledged as collateral. My stomach tightened as I reached the payment section of the contract. The loan history showed that not a single payment had been made since the mortgage was issued. The account had been marked delinquent for months before the bank finally triggered the foreclosure process that resulted in the notice now standing outside my store. But one question mattered more than anything else. Where had the money gone? I navigated deeper into the county filing attachments and located the reference number for the original loan disbursement. The document listed a transaction ID that linked directly to the bank's servicing portal. I opened a new browser tab and entered the loan number along with my identity information. For several seconds, the system processed the request before displaying the loan summary page. The status appeared in red letters across the top: loan in default. Beneath that was the transaction history, including the initial disbursement entry. $850,000 had been released in a single wire transfer on the day the mortgage was approved. I leaned closer to the screen and read the destination account information carefully. The name attached to the receiving account made my entire body go still: Judith Palmer. For a moment, I didn't move at all. My older sister's name remained on the screen, sitting beside the transaction that had transferred nearly $1 million out of the loan account. I refreshed the page once, then again, as if the system might correct itself. But the name didn't change: Judith Palmer. Growing up, Judith had always been the ambitious one in our family. She loved big ideas, big investments, and big risks. While I built a steady career in corporate human resources, Judith chased opportunities in real estate development and speculative property deals. She talked constantly about leverage, financing structures, and how smart investors used other people's money to move faster. Apparently, she had taken that philosophy further than I ever imagined. I leaned back slowly in the office chair, trying to connect the pieces of what I was seeing. 8 months ago, someone had submitted a mortgage application using my name. The contract pledged my store as collateral for the loan. The bank approved the application and released $850,000 in funds. That money had then been wired directly into Judith's account, which meant my sister had taken out a loan using my property and my identity. My eyes drifted toward the office window where the edge of the orange foreclosure notice was still visible outside. Judith hadn't just taken the money, she had also stopped making payments on the loan. The bank believed I was the borrower who had defaulted, which was why they were preparing to auction the property. A quiet realization settled over me as the full shape of the plan became clear. Judith must have believed that once the bank moved toward foreclosure, I would panic. She assumed I would do whatever it took to save the store, even if that meant paying off the loan myself. In her mind, the pressure from the bank would force me to quietly clean up the debt she had created. She had gambled that I wouldn't have any other option. I picked up my phone from the desk and opened my contact list. Judith's name sat exactly where it always had, just below the entries for my coworkers and suppliers. For a moment, I hesitated, thinking about the last conversation we had shared only a few weeks earlier. Nothing about her voice or her behavior had suggested that she was secretly using my property as collateral for a massive loan. Then I remembered the foreclosure notice outside my door. I pressed the call button. The phone rang twice before she answered. "Steph," Judith said casually, her voice relaxed and completely unaware of what I had just discovered. "What's going on?" I looked once more at the mortgage document glowing on my computer screen before replying. "We need to talk about the loan you took out using my store." Judith didn't respond immediately when I mentioned the loan. For a brief moment, the line went completely silent, as if the words had traveled across the distance and landed somewhere she hadn't expected. Then she let out a quiet breath. "So you saw it," she said. The calmness in her voice felt more unsettling than if she had denied everything. "Yes," I replied. "I saw the mortgage, the foreclosure notice, and the wire transfer." Another pause followed, shorter this time. "Well," Judith said lightly, "I figured you'd find out eventually." I sat still in the chair, staring at the glowing document on my computer screen. "You forged my signature," I said. "That's a dramatic way to describe it," she answered. "I just handled the paperwork. You took out an $850,000 loan using my property as collateral. It's not exactly like that. It is exactly like that." Judith exhaled again, this time sounding mildly annoyed. I could hear faint background noise behind her voice, the clinking of glasses and distant conversation. It sounded like she was sitting in a restaurant somewhere. "Steph, relax," she said. "This isn't a crisis." "There's a foreclosure notice on my store," I replied. "Yes, I know how the process works." The casual confidence in her voice made my stomach tighten. "You know the bank plans to auction the property in 2 weeks?" I asked. "That's just the first step in the legal timeline," she said calmly. "They always do that when a loan goes delinquent." I leaned forward slowly, gripping the edge of the desk. "Why is the loan delinquent?" Judith laughed quietly, the sound sharp and dismissive. "Because the project needed the money first," she said. "What project?" "The Salem development I told you about." The memory surfaced immediately. A few months earlier, she had mentioned a real estate project she was working on, something about converting an old apartment complex into high-end rental units. "You used my store to fund that?" I asked. "It was temporary capital," she replied. "Once the units sell, I'll repay the loan." "You didn't ask me." "You would have said no." "You're right," I said. Judith didn't sound bothered by that. "Look," she continued, "I needed fast financing. Traditional lenders take months to approve a deal, and the construction timeline couldn't wait. Using the property was the fastest way to secure the funds." "My property." "Our family property," she corrected. "No," I said quietly. "My property." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Judith said something that made the entire situation even clearer. "You'll pay the loan off before the auction anyway." I blinked slowly. "What?" "You love that little store too much to lose it," she said matter-of-factly. "The bank only wants the money back. Once the balance is cleared, the foreclosure disappears. You expect me to repay your loan." "It's not just my loan," she said. "It's attached to your property. You forged the documents." "And you'll fix the situation," she replied calmly. The certainty in her voice told me everything I needed to know. Judith had never intended to repay the loan herself. Her entire plan relied on the assumption that when the foreclosure notice appeared, I would panic and immediately clear the debt to protect the store. In her mind, the risk had always belonged to me. "You let the loan default on purpose," I said slowly. "It accelerated the timeline," she admitted, "so the bank would pressure me." "That's how leverage works, Steph." I looked again at the mortgage contract glowing on the computer screen. $850,000. "You're gambling with everything I built." "No," she said calmly. "I'm borrowing against it." "You forged my name." "Details." I felt something inside me settle into a colder, more controlled kind of focus. "Judith," I said quietly, "you should come to the store." "Why?" "Because we should have this conversation face to face." She hesitated for a moment. "Are you going to yell at me?" she asked. "No." "Are you going to threaten lawyers?" "No." "What are you going to do?" I glanced toward the office window where the orange foreclosure notice was still visible outside. "Talk," I said. Another pause followed. "Fine," Judith replied. "I'm about 40 minutes away. I'll stop by." "Good." When the call ended, the office felt strangely calm again. Judith believed she had forced me into a corner. In her mind, there were only 2 possible outcomes. Either I paid the debt to save the store, or the bank seized the property and everything I built disappeared. But as I sat there staring at the property records still open on the screen, a quiet thought began forming in my mind. Judith had built her entire plan on one assumption. She believed the store still belonged to me personally, and that assumption was about to become the biggest mistake she had made. After the call ended, I remained seated in the office chair for several minutes, staring at the mortgage contract still open on my screen. Judith believed she had forced a financial trap around my store. In her mind, the pressure from the bank would eventually push me into paying the loan just to protect what I had built. But the more I looked at the paperwork, the clearer it became that her entire plan rested on information that was already outdated. About a year earlier, long before any of this happened, I had sat in a small conference room with a business attorney discussing how to protect the store as it continued to grow. At the time, the shop had started generating steady profits, and I had begun thinking about expanding the business into online sales and wholesale partnerships. The attorney had explained that once a small business starts to accumulate value, personal ownership can become a liability. If someone files a lawsuit or a financial dispute emerges, personal assets tied directly to the owner could become exposed. His recommendation had been straightforward: transfer the property and the business operations into a limited liability company. Within a few weeks, I created Carter Retail Holdings, LLC. The process required state registration forms, new tax identification documents, and a formal transfer of ownership. The land where my store stood, along with the building itself, was legally moved from my personal name into the name of the company. I remained the sole owner of the LLC, but technically the property was no longer owned by me as an individual. At the time, it felt like a simple administrative decision, a precaution meant to protect the future of the business. Once the transfer was completed, the new deed listing Carter Retail Holdings, LLC as the owner was filed in the county property registry. After that, I barely thought about it again, until now. I opened another browser tab and accessed the state corporate registry database. Within seconds, the company record appeared on the screen. The filing date for the LLC formation sat clearly in the record, followed by the document confirming the property transfer into the company's ownership. I compared the dates carefully with the mortgage contract still open in the other window. The difference was impossible to ignore. The property had been transferred into the LLC 12 months before the mortgage loan appeared in the county records, which meant when Judith forged my signature and submitted the loan application, the property was no longer legally mine as an individual asset. The bank had approved a mortgage based on collateral that technically didn't belong to the borrower listed in the contract. I leaned back slowly in the chair, letting the realization settle into place piece by piece. Judith believed she had found a clever financial shortcut. She assumed that by forging my signature, she could temporarily use my store as leverage to secure funding for her development project. She counted on the idea that if the loan went into default, I would be forced to clean up the situation to protect the business. But she had built that entire strategy on one outdated assumption. She thought the store still belonged to me personally. My eyes moved again to the mortgage document on the screen. The borrower listed in the contract was Stephanie Carter. The collateral description referred to the land parcel where the store stood. But legally, the ownership of that land had already been transferred to Carter Retail Holdings, LLC, months before the mortgage even existed, which meant Judith had pledged collateral that the borrower didn't legally control. Banks take collateral verifications seriously. If a borrower misrepresents ownership of an asset during a loan application, the loan itself can become invalid. And if the signature authorizing the loan is forged, the situation moves beyond a financial dispute into something much more serious. Fraud. I turned my chair toward the window and looked outside at the orange foreclosure notice still standing in the grass near the walkway. Judith believed that sign meant she had already won. She thought the bank's pressure would eventually force me to rescue the property by paying the debt she created. What she didn't realize was that the moment the bank discovered the truth about the ownership records, the entire structure of the loan would collapse. And once that happened, the bank would stop looking at me as the borrower. They would start looking for the person who submitted the mortgage application. I turned back to the desk and picked up my phone again. The foreclosure notice included the bank's official contact number along with the loan reference code. If the fraud department reviewed the mortgage file alongside the ownership registry I had just confirmed, the discrepancy would be obvious within minutes. Judith believed the bank was my problem, but if I made one simple call, the bank might become hers. I dialed the number printed on the foreclosure notice and waited as the line began to ring. The fraud investigation department answered on the third ring. A calm male voice introduced himself as Daniel Brooks, a senior investigator assigned to mortgage irregularities. I gave him the case number printed on the foreclosure notice and the property address of my store outside Portland. He listened carefully while I explained what I had discovered in the county records. I told him that a mortgage had been issued using my name 8 months earlier, that the signature on the contract was not mine, and that the property listed as collateral was no longer owned by me personally. Daniel did not interrupt while I spoke. I could hear the faint clicking of a keyboard as he pulled up the loan file connected to the case number. After a few seconds, he asked a single question. "Ms. Carter, who currently holds the legal title to the property?" "The property is owned by Carter Retail Holdings, LLC, I said. There was a short pause on the line. "And when was the ownership transferred into that company?" he asked. I glanced at the registry page still open on my screen. "About 12 months before the mortgage was issued." The silence that followed lasted long enough for me to hear him typing rapidly. "According to our file," Daniel said slowly, "the borrower listed in the mortgage contract is Stephanie Carter as a private individual. The collateral description refers to the land parcel associated with your store." "That's correct," I replied, "but the property was transferred into the LLC before that loan existed." Another pause followed as he processed the information. "If the collateral listed in the mortgage application was not legally owned by the borrower at the time of approval," he said carefully, "that would represent a serious discrepancy in the documentation." "I also believe the signature on the mortgage contract was forged," I added. Daniel's tone shifted slightly, becoming more focused. "Do you have documentation confirming the ownership transfer into the LLC?" he asked. "Yes." "I'm going to ask you to send those documents to our department immediately," he said. "That would include the LLC formation filing, the recorded deed transfer, and any documentation confirming you did not authorize the mortgage." I opened my email and began attaching the files directly from the state registry and county database. Within minutes, the documents were sent. "Give me a moment to review these," Daniel said. The line went quiet while he examined the attachments. I sat in the small office of my store, listening to the soft hum of the overhead lights and the faint sound of cars passing on the road outside. Finally, he returned to the line. "Ms. Carter," he said, "the deed transfer you provided shows the property was legally owned by Carter Retail Holdings, LLC before the mortgage application was submitted." "That's what I found as well," I replied. "If that timeline is accurate," he continued, "then the borrower listed on the loan application did not legally control the asset used as collateral." "What does that mean for the foreclosure?" I asked. "It means the foreclosure process may have been initiated based on a loan that was approved using incorrect ownership information," he said. Another brief pause followed. "Additionally," Daniel added, "if the borrower's signature on the application was forged, the loan approval itself may fall under fraudulent documentation." The word fraud hung quietly in the air between us. "What happens next?" I asked. "The foreclosure process will be suspended while we conduct a full review of the loan file," he said. "Our department will verify the ownership records, examine the application documents, and trace the original disbursement of funds." I already knew where that trail would lead. "Do you know where the loan money was transferred?" Daniel asked. "Yes," I said. "Where?" "The entire amount was wired into an account under the name Judith Palmer." There was a noticeable pause. "Is Judith Palmer related to you?" he asked. "She's my sister." The silence returned again, heavier this time. "If the documentation confirms what you've described," Daniel said finally, "this matter could extend beyond the bank's internal review. Cases involving forged signatures and misrepresented collateral are often referred to federal financial investigators." I looked through the office window toward the bright orange foreclosure notice still standing in the grass outside my store. "Understood," I said. "We will contact you once the initial verification process is complete," Daniel continued. "In the meantime, the foreclosure action connected to your property will be temporarily halted." When the call ended, I set the phone down slowly. Judith believed the bank's foreclosure process was the weapon she had used to corner me. But the moment the bank started looking closely at the paperwork, the situation had already begun turning in a direction she never expected. Judith arrived at the store a little after 7:30 that evening, her car headlights sweeping across the parking lot before cutting off near the entrance. I watched through the window as she stepped out and glanced briefly at the bright orange foreclosure notice planted in the grass. Instead of looking concerned, she smirked slightly, as if the sign confirmed that everything was unfolding exactly the way she expected. I unlocked the door before she could knock. She walked inside with the same confident posture she carried into every business conversation, her heels clicking against the wooden floor as she looked around the store. Her eyes moved slowly across the display racks, the polished shelves, and the rows of boots and sneakers lining the walls. "Still looks the same," she said casually. "It's been one day," I replied. Judith shrugged and leaned lightly against the front counter, crossing her arms. "So," she said, "have you figured out how you're going to handle the loan yet?" I watched her carefully. "You mean your loan," I said. "Our situation," she corrected calmly. "The foreclosure notice outside says the bank plans to auction the property in 14 days. "That's just procedure," she replied immediately. "Banks always start with a notice. If the debt gets paid before the auction date, everything disappears." "You expect me to pay it?" Judith gave a small smile. "You're the one who owns the store," she said. "You forged my signature." "You're still focusing on the paperwork," she said dismissively. "The real issue is the loan balance." I walked slowly toward the counter and stopped across from her. $850,000, I said. "It funded a development project," she replied. "With my property?" "With collateral available to the family," she corrected. "This property isn't a family asset," I said, quietly. Judith tilted her head slightly, studying my expression as if trying to gauge whether I was angry enough to lose control of the conversation. "Steph, listen," she said in a calmer tone. "The Salem project is nearly finished. Once the units sell, I'll have more than enough to cover the loan. This is temporary." "You let the loan go into default." "That accelerated the timeline. So the bank would pressure me. That's how leverage works." I let the silence stretch for a moment. Judith clearly believed the foreclosure notice meant she still controlled the situation. In her mind, the bank was simply applying pressure to force me into clearing the debt. "There's something you should know," I said. Judith raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "The property you used as collateral doesn't belong to me personally anymore." Her confident posture shifted slightly. "What do you mean?" she asked. "A year ago, I transferred the land and the building into a company called Carter Retail Holdings, LLC. Judith frowned. So the property listed in the mortgage contract wasn't personally owned by the borrower when the loan was issued. She stared at me for a second, processing the statement. "That doesn't matter," she said quickly. "The bank already approved the loan. They approved it based on documents that weren't accurate." Judith's expression hardened. "What are you saying?" she asked. "I'm saying the bank's fraud investigation department is reviewing the loan file right now." For the first time since she arrived, the confidence in her face cracked. "You called the bank?" she said. "I reported a forged mortgage tied to my name." Her arms slowly uncrossed. "You didn't have to do that," she said, her voice tighter now. "Yes, I did. We could have handled this privately." "You forged my signature and put my property at risk," I replied. Judith looked toward the window where the foreclosure notice stood outside, illuminated by the parking lot lights. "What exactly did you tell them?" she asked. "That the borrower's signature was forged and the property wasn't owned by me personally when the mortgage was issued." Her jaw tightened slightly. And I sent them the ownership records for the LLC." The silence that followed was heavier than anything earlier in the conversation. Judith began pacing slowly across the store floor, the confident rhythm she had walked in with completely gone. "You shouldn't have done that," she muttered. "Why?" "Because banks escalate things." "They already have." Judith stopped walking and looked at me. "What does that mean?" she asked. "It means the foreclosure process is being suspended while they investigate the mortgage. And after that? If the documents confirm what I reported, the case could be referred to federal investigators." The word federal landed like a stone in the quiet room. Judith didn't speak for several seconds. For the first time since she walked through the door, she looked uncertain. Outside, a passing car briefly illuminated the foreclosure notice before disappearing down the road. Judith followed the light with her eyes and then looked back at me. "You really did it," she said quietly. "I protected what's mine," I replied. Judith did not leave the store right away. She stood near the counter for several long seconds, staring at me as if trying to determine whether I was bluffing. The confidence she had walked in with was gone, replaced by the tight silence of someone recalculating a situation that had suddenly changed. "You shouldn't have involved the bank," she said finally. "They were already involved," I replied. "You know what I mean," she said, running a hand through her hair. "Once financial institutions start investigating things like this, it becomes a legal mess. That's what happens when someone forges a mortgage." Judith exhaled slowly and began pacing across the store floor. The steady clicking of her heels echoed through the quiet space between the shelves. "Steph, listen," she said, stopping near the display wall. "You're overreacting. The bank hasn't even finished their review yet." "They already have the documents." "They still have to verify them," she insisted. "Investigations take time." I watched her carefully. "And what do you plan to do during that time?" I asked. Judith looked at me, the sharp calculation back in her eyes. "I can fix this," she said. "How?" "I'll move money around," she replied quickly. "The development project has investors. If I restructure the capital flow, I can settle the loan before the bank decides to escalate anything." "You can't settle a loan that was issued with forged documents." Her jaw tightened. "You don't know that." "I know the bank's fraud department is already reviewing the ownership records." Judith looked toward the window where the foreclosure notice was still visible outside under the parking lot lights. "You should have told me about the LLC," she muttered. "You never asked." "That's not the point," she snapped. She stopped pacing and leaned against a shelf, crossing her arms again, though the posture lacked the confidence it had earlier. "Look," she said after a moment, "if this turns into a criminal investigation, nobody wins. That's not my decision." "You think the bank cares about family drama?" she continued. "They'll turn this into a federal case just to prove a point." "They care about fraud." Judith went quiet again. The silence stretched long enough that I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator unit near the back storage room. Finally, she spoke again. "What exactly did the investigator say?" she asked carefully. "That the foreclosure process is being suspended while they verify the documents. And after that? If the ownership records confirm the discrepancy, the case could be referred to federal financial authorities." Judith's eyes flickered for a moment. That was the reaction she had been trying to hide. She knew what federal investigation meant. Forgery tied to interstate banking documents wasn't a civil dispute. It was a criminal offense. "Steph," she said quietly, "you don't understand how complicated this will become." "I understand it perfectly." "No, you don't," she replied. "Once prosecutors get involved, they start digging through everything: accounts, transactions, contracts, every deal connected to the project. That's your problem. It becomes your problem too," she said quickly. "They'll want statements, testimony, documents." "I already gave them the documents." Judith stared at me again. For the first time that evening, the confidence in her voice was completely gone. "You really went through with it," she said. "I reported the truth." "You could have just told me first." "I did tell you," I replied. "You came here." She looked toward the door, then toward the office in the back, her mind clearly racing through options that no longer seemed possible. "You think this will destroy me," she said after a moment. "I think you made a decision," I replied. Now there are consequences. Outside, a car drove past on the road, its headlights briefly sweeping across the storefront window and the orange foreclosure notice standing in the grass. Judith watched the light move across the glass before turning back to me. "You always did things the careful way," she said quietly, "and you always took shortcuts." She gave a small, humorless laugh. "Shortcuts usually work. Not this time." Judith stood still for several seconds longer, as if waiting for something to change. Nothing did. Finally, she walked toward the door. Before leaving, she stopped and looked back at the store one more time. "You really think the bank is on your side now?" she said. "I think the paperwork is." She opened the door and stepped outside into the cool Oregon night. Through the window, I watched her pause near the foreclosure notice, staring at it under the streetlight. Earlier, that sign had been the weapon she used to trap me. Now it was the first piece of evidence in the investigation that had just begun. 3 days after Judith walked out of the store that night, my phone rang early Monday morning while I was sitting at my desk at work. The caller ID displayed the same number from the bank's fraud investigation department. I stepped into an empty conference room before answering. "Stephanie Carter," I said. "Ms. Carter, this is Daniel Brooks from the bank's fraud investigation unit," the voice on the other end replied. His tone sounded more direct than it had during our previous conversation. "I'm calling to update you regarding the mortgage file connected to your property." I closed the conference room door behind me. "Go ahead," I said. "Our team has completed the initial verification of the ownership documents you provided," Daniel explained. "The property deed clearly shows the land and building were transferred to Carter Retail Holdings, LLC 12 months before the mortgage application was approved." "That's correct. That means the collateral listed in the mortgage application was not owned by the individual borrower named in the contract." The words landed exactly the way I expected. "And the signature?" I asked. "Our forensic review concluded the borrower's signature on the mortgage document does not match your verified signature records," he said. "The loan application was submitted using forged authorization." I leaned slightly against the conference table. "What does that mean for the foreclosure?" I asked. "The foreclosure process has been officially suspended," Daniel replied. "The notice posted at your property will be removed within 24 hours. The bank cannot proceed with a foreclosure tied to a loan that was approved under fraudulent documentation." For the first time since this situation began, the weight in my chest eased slightly, but Daniel wasn't finished. "In addition," he continued, "our investigation traced the full disbursement of the loan funds. The entire $850,000 was wired into a financial account under the name Judith Palmer." "Yes," I said quietly. "Based on the forged signature, the ownership discrepancy, and the financial transfer records, the case has now been referred to federal financial investigators for further action." The word federal didn't surprise me anymore. "I understand," I said. "You may be contacted again if investigators require additional statements," Daniel added. "But from the bank's perspective, the mortgage tied to your property is now considered invalid. Thank you for letting me know." When the call ended, I stood in the quiet conference room for a moment before walking back to my desk. The day passed normally after that. Meetings, emails, employee issues, the same routine work I had done for years. That evening, I drove back to the store. As I turned into the parking lot, the first thing I noticed was the empty patch of grass near the entrance. The bright orange foreclosure notice was gone. The building looked exactly the way it always had. The front windows reflected the soft evening light, and the wooden sign above the door still carried the same name I had installed years earlier. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The store smelled the same as it always did, a mixture of polished wood and new leather. The shelves stood neatly arranged, the display racks perfectly aligned. Everything I had built was still here. Judith's plan had relied on one simple belief. She thought I would panic. She thought I would quietly pay the loan just to make the problem disappear. And most of all, she believed no one would ever look closely at the paperwork. But the truth about situations like this is simple. The moment someone decides to take what isn't theirs, they also decide to risk everything that follows. A few weeks later, I learned that the investigation into the loan had moved forward quickly. Accounts connected to the funds were frozen while authorities reviewed the financial records tied to the transaction. The real estate project Judith had been so confident about collapsed almost immediately once the money trail was examined. Meanwhile, my store continued exactly the way it always had. Customers walked in, tried on shoes, and left with the same quiet satisfaction that had kept the business alive for 8 years. Every time I passed the spot where the foreclosure notice once stood, I remember how close everything came to being taken away because someone believed they could quietly manipulate the situation. But sometimes the quietest people are the ones who understand the rules best. And when the rules finally come into play, the truth has a way of revealing itself. Now I'm curious about something. If you had walked up to your business one evening and found a foreclosure notice like that waiting for you, what would you have done? Would you have handled it privately with family, or would you have done exactly what I did and let the truth come out through the system? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. I always enjoy hearing how different people would respond in situations like this. And if you enjoy stories about hidden power, family betrayal, and the moment when quiet patience turns into real justice, make sure you stay with the channel and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. This narrative is dramatized for storytelling impact.